There we go. Yeah.
I think you
Okay,
said
I'll
Stuart was going to read, right?
Okay, go for it, Stuart.
Okay, first of all, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, substance abuse disorders, a conversation with Joe Bailey, psychologist, author, and former consultant and CEO coach at the Mayo Clinic. Anna Studley. Joe, thank you for talking with me today. Can I start by asking, how did you come to be working in the addiction field? Okay, Joe Bailey. I originally trained as a clinical psychologist. I did my internship in a Minnesota mental health center, which was just starting up as a part of a national community mental health center movement in the United States. And so everything was new, a whole new staff, new programs. To be honest, nobody knew what they were doing. Laughs. It was 1981, and here I am, 23 years old, and they said, Joe, you're in charge of the addiction program. I said, but I've had no training in addiction. And they said, well, nobody else has either, so you're in charge.
Mhm.
I did know what I did not know what I was doing. My first experience was to go to a methadone maintenance group for heroin addicts. I walked into the group as the facilitator and quickly saw that people in there had guns and knives. My life was threatened in that very first session. It was my baptism of fire into addiction. Kana, oh no, what did you do? Joe, well, luckily for me, there was a volunteer at the agency, an ex-Marine, straight out of Vietnam. His neck was about this big, I'm assuming like this, and his head about this big with a severe crew cut. I am an anti-war guy. I'm there as a conscientious objector. So we had this very opposite view of life, but we were thrown together to help these people. Bud was his name, and he was the happiest person I had ever met up to that point in my life. He had a smile this big. He would walk into a room and it would light up. He found so much joy and serenity in his recovery from a very serious addiction problem. So that's how I got into the addiction field. Kana, I guess it was meant to be. So what happened next? Joe, well, I was hired by the Texas Department of Mental Health to become a trainer for addiction counselors. Dr. Sidney Wolfe, who had done all this research out of Washington, D.C., on the effectiveness of different therapeutic approaches, came up with all these traits of an effective counselor. So looking back, what we did was a very outside-in approach, meaning we were focused on changing the outside behaviors. We would try to teach people how to confront, how to show empathy, how to be intimate, how to share your feelings in the moment. I ended up being a trainer in the field of addiction counselors, and then later was made the director of prevention for the state of Texas for alcoholism. I kind of got thrown into the deep end of the pool of addiction. What was the approach back then? Joe, the primary focus of treatment in those days was 12 steps. It was all about detoxification, getting people into AA and working a program with a sponsor. The therapy and treatment centers was highly confrontational. We believed we had to really wake these people up. So no TLC, but a lot of heavy confrontation because of the denial of the clients. The level of burnout was extremely high amongst the counselors. So I knew there had to be a better way, but I didn't know what it was. Later, I moved back to Minnesota and worked at one of the main training institutes in America for addiction counselors in the family program. Virginia Satir was our consultant. She was a very famous family therapist. We had a family therapy model where we tried to bring the whole family in to be involved in the treatment, which was a step forward. Because the families were often left in the dark about all this, the extent of the problems and the treatment, the healing had to happen with the families. That had to happen with the families was very important. So that's kind of my background, how I got into the field. kind of by accident. Kana, that's very unusual. When I was living in Southern California, I worked with a lot of addicts and alcoholics who had been through multiple treatment programs. Most of the drug and alcohol counselors I met were recent patients in the programs they are now teaching in, who I might add often admitted they were high while working. Joe, yes, I personally have never had a drug or alcohol problem, which was unusual because, as you say, most people who work in the addiction field profession are recovering themselves. So what happened next? Next, I went into private practice. Most of my practice was doing family therapy and couples therapy with people in recovery. Within a few years, I was experiencing severe burnout myself. I was actually ready to quit the profession. I started fantasizing about working in a greenhouse with my father growing trees because I just saw people as coming through a never-ending revolving door. They come back into therapy with this issue this week. Next week was another issue, and it was all focused on solving problems and dealing with issues. And it was a problem, focused on a diagnostic disease, focusing on identifying, admit you're an alcoholic or a drug addict or an incest victim or whatever you take on that, or whatever you take on that label. It never felt right to me. You had to identify with your disease. You had to admit that you had a problem. You had to always be on guard for it, not to come back. Like a virus, you have to vigilantly take care of yourself or you will get sick again. That sounds exhausting. Right. So I was kind of disillusioned with the results. And again, I started thinking about what else I can do to make a living when my good friend Keith Blevins called me and told me about Sydney Banks. He'd been sending me Sid Banks tapes for years, which I just dismissed. I'd been involved in so many encounter groups and New Age therapies and Eastern stuff, I was searching. One day, when I called to say Sid was going to be doing conference at the University of Miami Medical School, something beyond my intellect pulled me like a magnet to go there. So I met Sid, and the same day I met my wife. We had been married for 40 years, so the stars were aligned that day. So I had a very successful practice, probably one of the most successful in our area in terms of my reputation of working with families, working with couples in recovery. But when I came back, I just couldn't do what I had been doing before, which was taking people back in the past, beating pillows with a taka bat,
Mm-hmm.
bringing their whole family and reliving all the trauma, going through every detail, confessing, blah, 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 all that. And I couldn't do it anymore. I had seen something. I didn't know what, but it transformed the way I work with people. And I just kind of flew by the seat of my pants and just started sharing insights I was having and insights I was having. And anytime I would share about the principles, the clients, instead of resisting, they were like, wow, well, tell me more. I had a practice with Christine Heath, and initially it shrunk because everyone got better. I got a little worried economically, but then they told me all their friends, and pretty soon they told all their friends, and pretty soon we were overloaded with so many clients, we had to begin a training program to train other people in the principles. And so we started the Minneapolis Institute of Mental Health, a program for addiction and for severe mental health issues, schizophrenia, etc. We had a psychiatrist on staff, a full array of social workers and addiction counselors, all of that. And we did that for 10 years, including some great research. Amazing. What were you seeing that inspired you to keep going? I knew that what we were onto with the principles would transform the field of addictions, but I wasn't sure how that was going to happen. We started working with Hazleton. It was the first inpatient treatment center in America, and it's headquartered where I live in Minnesota. We were working with women's program, teaching them the principles, and their staff burnout rate plummeted, and their results skyrocketed with teaching the principles to women in recovery, even though it's part of a traditional 12-step program. And so we were doing a talk on the principles of serenity because serenity is a big term in the recovery field. The result of spiritual awakening is that you experience a feeling of serenity. and that is the antidote to relapse. And so we gave a seminar called The Principles of Serenity. And it kind of showed how that feeling of serenity that can happen through a spiritual awakening, how that works scientifically through the principles. So I was giving this talk with Mavis Carnes, and that at the end of the talk, a guy came up to me and said, "You really need to write a book about this. This is really very interesting." And I said, "Oh, nice. I don't write. I hate to write." And he said, "No, I'll help you. Don't worry. Your ideas are very important, and we really want to publish your book." So I said, "Okay." So I ended up writing the Serenity Principle. And in the middle of writing it, I was giving a talk at the state conference on addiction about the principles. And a woman from the Hazleton publication department came up to me with a check for $4,000 and a contract that said, "We want to publish your book." I said, "Well, I already have a publisher." And they said, "Well, we will get it out to the whole recovery field." And I said, "Okay, are you sure? This could be controversial because they're straight AA." Wow. So would you say that part of your message is that you don't have to go through AA? I wasn't really shunning or dismissing it. It was more about understanding the principles behind it, how it worked. What is the ingredient that actually is working and what isn't working? We were very respectful, but we wanted to show why the relapse rate was so high, why going back in the past, reliving the past, doing fourth and fifth steps and all that doesn't always help. And so that was all in the book. So Hazleton was going to publish it, and they made it the book of the year. Put it on the cover of that put it on the cover of their catalog. When I went out there to meet with them, they had a big banner. "Welcome Joe Bailey, author of the year." I thought, wow, what is happening? It said, "This is going to happen. It is really happening." I was terrified. I had nightmares that I would be hung in effigy by the AA community because they can be very aggressive. So I decided to meet with Dr. Dan Anderson, who founded Hazleton. He was the president, and I said, "I thought I should meet with you before the book comes out because it could be very controversial." And he says, "Well, that didn't, well, didn't you get my letter?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, we're not publishing your book." I said, "It's supposed to come out in 3 weeks. It's already printed. What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we sent the book out to all of our counselors, and 40 of them said they would quit if we published your book." And I'm like, wow, what the hell is going on? And so I said, "Well, what did you think was going to happen?" He said, "I loved your book, but I think it's 20 years ahead of its time." So I thought, okay, now what am I going to do? So I called the guy who had originally asked me to write it, and here's how life works. His publishing company in Minnesota got bought out by Collins, the largest publisher in the world. He was now the editor of the psychology, spirituality division of Harper. And when I called him, he said, "Don't worry, Joe, we will publish it. Controversy sells books." That's how I ended up writing the book. And that's what got this into the addiction field. It's still used a lot in treatment centers all over the world and still sells really well. But that book is what really helped me get into treatment centers. So I started working with treatment systems, training counselors, and bringing this paradigm into the world of addiction. It's challenging because you have a lot of people whose lives were saved by AA. So they are often very resistant. So that's the kind of long introduction to how I got into the field of recovery with the principles. Ghana, amazing. Can you tell me about Gulf Breeze Treatment Center in Florida? It's described on the website as a world-class, non-12-step, holistic alcohol abuse and drug addiction treatment facility. Joe, yes, I was working with the Mayo Clinic physicians when Debbie Trent and Barnett Gilmer hired me to be their consultant to design the program for Gulf Breeze from the ground up. So this was the first time I could come in fresh and train everyone from the beginning with the principles and design the whole program around a more educational model rather than a confrontational one. I didn't have to blend it with other paradigm, and it's been extremely successful. providing great care and guidance to thousands of people who were suffering. Kana, so what if what if I was to play devil's advocate for a moment and say to you, but it's a disease? What would your response be to that? Joe, well, I would say that on one level, it's true that when people are addicted to alcohol or drugs, they have some symptomology. They have a common list of characteristics, and their body is sick. Most of the time, at the later stages, they need medical attention. But first, they need to be treated through gradual detoxification so they don't go into convulsions. And depending on if it's heroin or narcotics or alcohol or whatever it is, there are different protocols. So you do treat the whole person. The withdrawal protocols that we use are very gentle, but throughout, even the detoxification part of treatment, people are gradually introduced to listening to Sid Banks tapes. They'll meet with their counselor to develop a relationship. So, but some of these people are extremely sick physically. We have a very holistic approach at Gulf Breeze. So in that sense, there is a disease. But the idea of labeling a person as an alcoholic has a counterproductive aspect to it. It doesn't mean that you didn't have an addiction, but to carry that through life as an identity perpetuates this idea that keeps a person from evolving beyond that identity. So now it doesn't mean that once you get the principles, you can just go out and drink or use heroin just fine. We encourage people to use their wisdom, their common sense. Next. Next page. Wendy. Wendy. Use their common sense that in this early stages, they may need to go to bars or be hanging out with their drinking buddies. Yes, in the stories that follow, relapse seems to come back because of a lack of awareness. Right. These are just common sense things, and they do need to get a grounding in what it feels like to live without drugs and alcohol. Because people use drugs and alcohol in order to suppress negative emotions, when they get high on pot or whatever, they suddenly forget what they're worried about. They forget what they're angry about. Our natural innate mental health, our serenity, bobs to the surface. So the principles educate people in treatment how the mind works so they can access this natural state of serenity. This is the goal of AA, by the way, to experience feelings of serenity, a spiritual awakening, which to me is what the three principles activate. The process of awakening to your true nature. Universal mind, that's a universal intelligence that you call spiritual. You could call God, but you don't have to. When you experience that transformation, your desire to look outside is lessened. The depth of that experience negates the need to look outside to substances. In traditional treatment, a lot of times people will go for treatment for alcohol and then have an eating disorder or become addicted to something else. Kana, yes, when I lived in LA, I met people who were in 3 or 4 or even 5 different 12-step programs. I always thought that must be confusing. And then I noticed that they would go to one when it got a little bit close to some truth. They would decide to focus on another one and so on, jumping from one to the other. Joe, yeah, and then they have to go to specialized treatment programs for each of these things. They were telling me they went to 12-step meetings, but when I asked them what step they were on, they weren't actually doing any of the 12-step work, so nothing really changed. Most seem to treat it as free group therapy. And so they are not really getting at the heart of the problem, which is the disease of not knowing how we create our experience from the inside out. The principles educate people on how we are creating our moment-to-moment experience that can take us away from the feeling of serenity, of mental health, this natural resilience that we are all born with. It can't be destroyed, can't be harmed in any way, and can only be covered with the innocent misuse of thought. So that's the whole program. It's an education about how the principles work so that people can access this natural state of mental health or serenity, which is what recovery is all about. A lot of people in AA and other 12-step programs have used my book or learned about the principles. So it's beginning to be seen as the missing piece in the treatment. Kana, I know that AA has saved many lives, but it seems to have been hijacked by therapeutic language and techniques and has lost its original spiritual message. Joe, right. I think if Bill W. met Sydney Banks, they would have been friends. They would have had a shared experience of spiritual awakening and enlightenment. Bill W. did the best he could to find out how to help other alcoholics have this experience he had. That's the feeling we would call innate health. You feel peace of mind. You feel your mind isn't as busy. You feel calmer. You feel happier, a natural joy. You don't have to look outside to get that feeling. It's innate. So they would have been in complete agreement. Jesus, Allah, and the Buddha, they'd all be sitting around having a good talk about this. Kana, do you have maybe a couple of stories of people you know, like an example of someone who had tried all these things and then came across the principles?
Stuart, would you like somebody else to read?
Uh, yeah, sure.
Okay, just to give you a break. Who else? Nancy, you want to read? Lori?
I don't mind. Sorry. What an interesting story I have to editorialize. This is amazing. Okay. Joe. Well, there are thousands of stories I can tell of people who have tried many roads to recovery, from 12 steps to behavior modification to religion, being a born again Christian or whatever. And when they found the principles, it was the missing link, as Sid would call it. It was the missing piece. I like how they spell peace.
Yeah.
Because without an understanding of the principles, the inside out nature of experience, the connection between thought and feeling, you can't separate them. Feelings don't get stored in the body, they're connected to thought, and that's always moving. I'll just tell one story. Bill was a gang leader. He murdered people, was a drug dealer, and was in prison. He was in prison for many years and was the head of the prison gang. So he was the godfather, if you like. You want drugs in prison? You went to Bill. He's half Native American and half African American. And so his whole identity was the gang, with being the dealer, with the big pimp mobile, the Cadillac or the Continental, and the fancy clothes and all the women. He had been through treatment many times in prison, out of prison, and he would be sober for a while. But he would always eventually relapse because it was all dependent on going to the meetings. There's a lot of fear that if you missed a meeting, you might relapse. A lot of fear, a lot of rules that you had to do in order to stay sober. So it was like what they call it white knuckling it. It was always hanging on tight to his sponsor to go into a meeting every day, sometimes many a day, two a day, to stay sober. I think it was through a police officer in St. Paul who was working with gangs that Bill first found out about the principles in the neighborhood where I had my clinical practice. We had a lot of gangs, and there was a cop there, Ed Lemon. I had given a talk at Martin Luther King Center about the principles, and he was there, and he was kind of a tough cop. So he came up to my office and he said, "This is a bunch of bullshit." And then he read my book. He threw it down on my desk and said, "This is crap. You can't do this." And I said, "Let's have a cup of coffee." So we sat down to talk. But he was so curious. And finally, he just really caught on to the principles. He started working with gangs and all these kids. And that's how Bill found out about it. He hasn't relapsed since. He's now one of the most generous human beings I've ever met. His whole life is just devoted to helping people in recovery through the principles. He's really the embodiment of someone who can walk in the 12-step world, but brings the message of the principles in a way that really gets to the people who really need to hear that and have gained that understanding. So he's impacted thousands of people. And they're now working with the homeless population in the Twin Cities, which has a huge alcohol and drug problem as well. We were working with an agency there that has 600 employees. I'm going to be giving the keynote speech at their annual meeting in a couple of weeks. So they're really starting to see how the principles could help their people. Their staff are very burned out. They were right at the heart of the George Floyd incident. It was in their neighborhood. So I'm hoping this will really help them in their work. Huh. Wow, that's amazing, Joe. Thank you so much.